In this tutorial, we're going to go through how to install and configure Python for your Windows computer. This is for purposes of being able to run Python code and debug that code in a meaningful way. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is download and install a version of Python. It's likely that you already have a version of Python on your computer, and the way to check this is if you go to your Windows Start menu and type cmd and open the command prompt, you're going to see this interactive command dialog. The command to check where Python is installed is where Python, and it'll give you a list of the different places where it has Python already installed. The problem is that even though you have this installed, you're probably not going to be able to use this version of Python to add packages to it and to be able to run it in an interactive way. So we need to install our own version that we can control, that we can install packages, and that we can configure in the right way. So to do that, let's first go to search for something called Miniconda Python. So Miniconda Python is an installation of Python that comes with what's called a package manager. There's different kinds of package managers. The two most popular ones are called Conda and pip, that's PIP. And you can use either of those to easily install packages through the command line interface. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about the package that you want to install. So to download this, we'll search for Miniconda Python, go to downloading, download Miniconda. Note that there's an Anaconda and a Miniconda. You're going to want the Miniconda one because the Anaconda installation comes with some extra software that kind of gets in the way. So we'll go to download Miniconda and then find the right version. It's probably going to be the Windows 64-bit installation. Okay, so we'll click that and download it. And you should see that the download starts right away. So we'll look in our downloads folder. Sure enough, here's our Miniconda installation. So I'm going to go ahead and run this installation. We'll agree to the terms of service, and then I'm going to install just for me. I do want to create start menu shortcuts. You can choose whether or not you want to do that. You probably do want to do that. And then note we want to add Miniconda to the path variable. This is going to let your system know that anytime you type Python or anytime you load Python, it's going to look for this installation as one of the options. Remember that you probably have multiple versions of Python installed on your computer, so you need your computer to know that this particular one exists and that it's one that you want to use. And then I do want to register this Miniconda as my default Python on the system. So now that it's installed, let's click Next, and we're done. So now let's check and make sure that it was installed correctly. I'm going to open a new command window and type where Python. And now we see that, in fact, the new Python installation shows up. So that's great, and that's working correctly. Now if I type Python, it should enter into the interactive Python window where I could now actually execute Python code in this command prompt. Okay, so now we've installed Python. The next thing is going to be to install Visual Studio. We need to download Visual Studio VSCode. So be careful, there's two versions of Visual Studio that people confuse. There's Visual Studio, the proper development environment, and then there's VSCode. VSCode is a free open source development environment that you can download. So if you search for VSCode, go to the download page, you'll see that there's different download options. We'll go for the Windows, and we want to go for the user installer. So you can either click the main one or click the x64 version of your user installer. All right, I've already done that. So we have here the VS Code user setup option, and we're going to go ahead and execute that. So we'll accept our agreement. We will create a start menu folder. I'll add a desktop icon. And then these options here are sometimes really handy. So if you have Windows Explorer open and you want to open an entire folder in VS Code so that you can view all the contents automatically in VS Code, it's nice to have these options available. So that'll show up like when you right click this menu will include options to open a folder in VS Code. Okay, so we've installed it. Now let's go ahead and launch VS Code and see how that looks. All right, we have our VS Code window open. This development environment is a general development environment. We need to install tools that help, or extensions that help us actually run Python code. So to do that, you're going to go to this little extensions icon down here, and we can either search for Python. It turns out Python's a pretty popular thing, so it's the first thing on the list, and we'll click install. Close this out. So at this point, we should be pretty much ready to run our first Python file. What I'm going to do is close VS Code, and I'm going to go to a new location where I'm going to create a project. All right, I've opened a new folder here that's empty, and what I'm going to do is I want to create a new Python file. So I'm going to right-click in this space. I'm going to say New, and I'm going to say a new text document. I'm going to call this document whatever I want my test Python file to be. And then I need to change the extension to .py. It's going to ask if I really want to do that. Yes, I do. So now if I right-click in this space, on Windows 10 I need to show more options. I should be able to see Open with Code. So I'll click that. And now my VS Code is going to ask me if I trust this. Yes, I do. And then over here you see in the Explorer area the Python file that we just created. So this development environment has now opened this folder, and I have this empty Python file that I've just created. So I'll just start off by typing something simple and just make sure it works. Now if I'm going to run this file, there's a couple different ways to do it. First I'll save the file, Control S or File Save. And then this menu option over here lets me run files. So let's go ahead and run this file. It's going to ask us for a configuration. You can just click Python file. And then you'll see some things happening down here. It's running the file that you selected and giving information. But the important thing is that it printed out our hello world statement correctly, which means our Python installation is working. So at this point, you now have code that you can write and run with Python using VS Code as the development environment. There's a couple important things that we need to then follow up with to make sure that we can actually run problems for the course and have the right packages installed. So you need to use a package manager to add features or add packages to Python that we need in order to execute our problems. There's a few that are commonly used, and they'll be noted on homework assignments and in lectures. But when you're using Python, in order to use a package, you need to import it. So we would typically say something like import math. And then if we wanted to run, say, y is equal to the cosine of some value, maybe 1.2, Python doesn't actually by default know what cosine is. It has to reference this math library. So we'd say math.cosine to actually get the value of the cosine. And if we run this, right, we should see it works. It imports the package, evaluates the cosine, prints it out. So anytime we're using functions that are not inherently defined by Python, which is most of the time, we need to import those packages and reference them. So there's a few that come by default with the Python installation, but there's others that we're going to want to use. There's a package called NumPy. NumPy is not by default included in the Python distribution. You note that if you try to type import NumPy, it says I don't know what this is, right? So we have to install this ourselves. The way to do that is to again go to our command window, and then we need to do a couple things. We're going to use the Miniconda package managers that we've installed, but first we need to tell the package manager which version of Python we're going to be managing. So we do that by using the following command: conda activate base. Okay, and now you should see on the left-hand side there's a base signifier that says that this is the version of Python that we're going to be working with. So once you've done this, now we can type our package installation command. So this is usually going to be something like either conda install and then the package name here. There's also by default a package called pip. So pip install and then the package name here. So we want to, let's go ahead and use pip. I find it to be a little bit more reliable. So pip install and then the name of the package. Well, we want numpy. So let's type numpy, hit enter, and then it's going to go look for numpy. Okay, so it says now it's successfully installed that. If we go back here and look again, we should see that numpy has resolved in some way. Now it might still be dark colored because it's not being used in the code, but let's say I wanted, just make sure that that's working. I'm going to say x is equal to some numpy, and then a command that I know exists in numpy is linspace. This is going to give me back an array of values from, say, 0 to 1, and there's maybe 20 points, 0 to 1. And if I printed that out, we would see down here my array of 20 values in the span from 0 to 1. Okay, so this is how you install packages. There's a number of packages that we're going to want to install. So those include numpy. There's also a package called scipy, so pip install scipy. There's a package for plotting called matplotlib. So if you have these numpy, scipy, and matplotlib, you've gone most of the way for your installation. There's other common ones like pandas that we may end up using or you might use. But you can just list them out. It's going to go through, install all those packages, and you'll be set. So once you've done that, you've gotten far enough that you can actually run code that's needed for this course. There's one last thing that I think is really important to be able to do when you're running Python code, and that is learning how to debug the code. With VS Code in that development environment, it's really easy to do. You just have to know how to approach it. So let's look at an example. This is the first lecture example where we have a hay bale that's generating energy, and we've written some Python code to be able to model this. So I'm going to go ahead and open this folder with VS Code and open the Python file. So the first thing to notice is that there's a couple of import statements, some code, and then I'm doing some evaluations down here and printing out the result. That's just how this particular example is structured. If, let's say, we're going through and we want to know what's the value of my plastic conduction resistance, I'm computing this value, but I'm not necessarily printing it out, and I don't really want to print out every single thing that I'm doing and run the whole program and look at the values every single time. I want to be able to stop as I'm running the code and look at the calculations, much the same way you would look at the values as you're doing it by hand. Well, it turns out it's really easy to stop the program as it's running and inspect the values if you run the program in debug mode. The way to handle this, and the first thing to do, is to set a point where you want to break the code, where you want to stop or pause the code's execution. It's called a breakpoint. If you take your mouse and you move over to the left side of the line numbers, you'll see that there's a red dot that appears. And that red dot indicates it's ready to set a breakpoint on that line. So if I go ahead and click, so I'll click here, that dot turns bright red. I've set a breakpoint. Now if I run this code in debug mode, it's going to stop the code execution at that point. So we can go here to my run and debug menu. I can go up here, start debugging. Either way is going to be fine. Or you can click the F5 key, which is a keyboard shortcut, to do the same thing. So I'm going to start debugging. I'm going to run my Python file, and it now starts running and it stops execution. You can see that the code is now highlighted at this point. So what it's done is it's computed all the lines of code up to that point, stored the values, and now stopped here and has not yet executed this line. So there's some really interesting information. If you look over on the left-hand side, you can see the variables, the local variables that you've created, and then the values that they've been assigned. So I can hover over as well and see our bale is 16.4042. thickness is this value, and so on. You can see the value of everything involved. We haven't yet evaluated this, so if I hover over this variable, it doesn't give me any information. But I can step forward one line at a time and look at how these values change. So I do that by using one of these two. So step into is going to, let's say I have a function, it's going to go into that function. I just want to use the step over. So I'll go ahead and step over. And now we'll see that there's a value that's been evaluated for our cond p. So you can just continue to go through the code, stepping as you need to. And then that gives you a really powerful way to stop and check and make sure that the calculations are doing what you want them to do. If you want to then continue running the program without stopping, you can use these other controls. So continue will run the rest of the program. If you need to restart the code from the beginning, you can do that, or just kill the process. That's right here. So we'll go ahead and resume the code, and then you'll see at the end it's printed out and successfully completed the program. So that's how you run Python code debugging mode in VS Code.